If the world's shipping routes stopped working, how long would it take before a problem at sea became a problem inside our homes? Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, making coffee, checking your phone, getting ready for work, without realizing that somewhere across the ocean, thousands of ships have stopped moving. Not because the world ran out of ships, because the routes connecting them have broken. At first, you wouldn't notice. Your supermarket would still be open. Your factory would still be running. Your phone would still work. But every hour those ships remain stuck, something else runs out of time. A missing part, a delayed shipment, a factory waiting for one container. And eventually, the problem crosses the ocean and reaches your doorstep. Because the world doesn't just depend on what ships carry. It depends on the ships arriving. So if the routes connecting the global economy suddenly collapsed, what would disappear from your life first? Right now, somewhere on Earth, a factory is waiting. The machines are ready. The workers are there. But one small container hasn't arrived. It could be carrying a component worth only a few dollars. And yet, without it, an entire production line may have to wait. The strange part is that nobody looking at the factory would see the real problem. It's somewhere out at sea. That is how deeply shipping has disappeared into everyday life. A container leaves a factory in Asia. It crosses an ocean, passes through a narrow canal, reaches a massive port, and is transferred onto a truck or train. Most of the time, we never think about that journey. We only notice it when something arrives late. Ships arrive. Ports unload. Trucks move. Factories receive what they ordered. And somewhere else, another shipment is already on its way. More than 80% of global trade by volume moves by sea. But here's what makes that system vulnerable. The world doesn't just depend on ships. It depends on the routes connecting those ships to everything else. And those routes aren't spread evenly across the planet. A few critical corridors carry an enormous amount of global traffic. So if one of them becomes unreliable, the first thing to break may not be a supermarket shelf. It may be a factory thousands of miles away that suddenly realizes it has no idea when its next shipment is coming. One morning, something strange begins happening at sea. Captains receive new instructions. Find another route. Some ships slow down. Others change course. And nobody on land can immediately see the full picture. A major shipping corridor has become unusable. Then another route comes under pressure. Ships that were supposed to pass through one corridor are suddenly looking for another way around. At first, it seems manageable. A ship can turn. A route can change. A container can wait. But the problem is that thousands of ships are making decisions inside the same network. A shipping manager watches an arrival time move from Tuesday to Friday, then to next week. A port prepares for vessels that suddenly aren't coming. Another port begins receiving ships it wasn't expecting. And somewhere in between them, containers start missing connections. There is no single moment when the global economy switches off. Instead, the system begins losing something much more important: predictability. And once companies can no longer trust when their cargo will arrive, they start making decisions based on what might happen next. They order earliest. They reserve extra space. They search for backup suppliers. And suddenly, everyone is trying to protect themselves at the same time, which creates a problem nobody can solve simply by looking at a map. If everyone starts looking for another route, where does everyone go? By the end of the first week, something unexpected happens. The first real problem isn't necessarily an empty supermarket. It's a factory that still has plenty of everything. Except one thing, a small component worth almost nothing compared with the machine it belongs to. The workers are ready. The orders are waiting. But production slows because that one missing piece is still somewhere at sea. And here's the part most people don't expect. A product can exist in abundance and still become unavailable. A manufacturer might have thousands of machines ready to ship. The raw materials might already be sitting in its warehouse. The workers might be standing beside the finished products. But if one critical component isn't arriving, all of that abundance becomes trapped. The product exists. The demand exists. The factory exists. The missing link is simply somewhere between them. And that logic can reach far beyond consumer goods. Medical equipment can depend on specialized parts. Industrial machines can depend on components made thousands of miles away. A repair can depend on something that costs less than the shipping container carrying it. Somewhere, an engineer could be standing beside a machine that should be running, waiting for a replacement part that is still moving through a disrupted supply chain. And now the factory manager has a decision to make. Wait for the shipment. Pay more for an emergency supplier. Or stop production and hope the route opens soon. Multiply that decision across thousands of businesses, and the problem changes shape. Companies start protecting whatever inventory they have left. Warehouses become more valuable. Shipping space becomes more expensive. And businesses that normally compete with each other begin chasing the same limited routes, ports, trucks, and suppliers. Then the effects begin reaching ordinary people. A repair takes longer because a replacement part hasn't arrived. A familiar product costs more. A store has stock on paper, but the next shipment has no reliable arrival date. And this creates something more dangerous than a simple shortage. Nobody knows what becomes difficult to replace next. Nobody knows which route will become available first. And nobody knows how long the inventory already inside the system can last. So the question is no longer just, what happens when ships stop arriving? It's, what happens when everyone starts preparing for the possibility that they won't? The obvious solution is simple. Go around. If one route is blocked, find another. But this is where the map becomes deceptive. Because oceans may look limitless, while the number of practical routes is surprisingly small. We've already seen what happens when ships avoid the Suez Canal. Many have been forced to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 3,500 nautical miles to some journeys. That's not just a longer line on a map. It's more fuel, more time at sea, more pressure on ships, more pressure on ports waiting at the other end. But here's the part that is easy to miss. The biggest bottleneck may eventually stop being the ocean. It may be the port. Imagine thousands of ships successfully finding alternative routes. They finally arrive. And then they wait. A port that was handling its normal traffic suddenly receives vessels from somewhere else. Containers pile up. Cranes work through the backlog. Trucks wait outside. Rail networks face new demand. The ships are moving again. But the cargo still isn't reaching its destination. Now imagine several major routes failing at once. Thousands of ships begin converging on the same alternatives. And companies begin paying more to secure whatever capacity is still available. But there is a deeper problem. You cannot simply build another Suez Canal because the existing one is crowded. You cannot create a new ocean overnight. And you cannot make thousands of ships arrive at the same port at the same time without creating another bottleneck. So the world would begin discovering an uncomfortable truth. A backup route only works when everyone isn't trying to use it at once. And now the problem is no longer simply getting everything somewhere. It becomes a question of priority. Medicine, food, fuel, industrial equipment, consumer goods. If the remaining routes cannot carry everything at once, who decides what gets through first? If the route stayed broken for months, something remarkable would happen. The world would stop asking when normal shipping would return, and start asking whether normal was ever safe in the first place. A company that once kept only a few days of inventory might begin storing weeks. A manufacturer might choose a supplier that's closer, even if it costs more. Governments might invest in new ports, railways, and trade corridors. Not because they're cheaper, because now reliability has become something worth paying for. Almost overnight, decisions that once looked inefficient begin to look wise. Extra warehouses, backup suppliers, more inventory sitting on shelves instead of moving constantly across oceans. The global economy wouldn't stop trading, but it would stop assuming that the fastest option is always the smartest one. That shift would come with a cost. More resilience means more expense. More redundancy means higher prices. And countries with the resources to secure alternative supply chains would adapt faster than those that depend heavily on imports. The shipping routes would eventually recover. Ships would sail again. Ports would clear. Trade would continue. But the system returning wouldn't be the same one that left. Because after living through months of disruption, the world would have learned a lesson that changes every decision that follows. For decades, globalization chased one goal: move things farther, faster, and cheaper. After a prolonged shipping crisis, the goal would become something very different. Keep the world moving, even when the shortest route disappears. Because efficiency made the world richer. Resilience would determine whether it keeps working. So how long could the world keep functioning if its shipping routes collapsed? Longer than you might think, but not indefinitely. The first thing to disappear wouldn't be everything on the shelves. It would be the confidence that the next shipment will arrive when expected. The confidence that the container will clear the port. That the factory will receive the part it ordered. That the next shipment is already on its way. At first, we would live on what the system had already delivered. Then businesses would search for alternatives. Then those alternatives would become more expensive, more crowded, and harder to maintain. And eventually, the question would no longer be how to make global trade cheaper. It would be how to make it survive the next disruption. Because that is the lesson hidden inside this entire scenario. The world's shipping network is incredibly powerful. But its power comes from coordination. Thousands of ships, millions of containers, hundreds of ports, and a handful of critical routes connecting them. When everything works, that complexity feels invisible. A package arrives. A factory runs. A supermarket stays stocked. Life simply continues. But when the routes begin to fail, we suddenly see the system underneath it all. Not as ships on a map, but as decisions made by people. A manager deciding whether to wait. A driver waiting for a container. A worker waiting for a missing component. A family wondering why something that used to arrive in days now takes weeks. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. What would disappear from your life first? Maybe it wouldn't be a product. Maybe it would be something harder to see. The confidence that tomorrow's delivery is already moving. The confidence that the parts keeping a factory alive are already on their way. The confidence that somewhere across the ocean, thousands of people and machines are still moving in perfect coordination. That is the real vulnerability. A shipping collapse wouldn't make the world suddenly run out of everything. It would slowly break the connection between what the world has and when the world can actually receive it. And that changes everything. Because modern life was built on an assumption most of us never think about. If we need something tomorrow, someone somewhere has already started moving it today. The world's shipping routes are not just lines across an ocean. They are the invisible roads connecting modern life. And perhaps the most important thing about them is also the easiest to forget. You don't notice the system holding the world together until you can no longer count on it moving.